So today we have our guest speaker is Paula Grieef. She is the resident naturalist at Hammock Marsh Interpretive Center. So a little bit about Paula. She's been birding all of her life, and she doesn't remember a time when she couldn't identify at least some birds. She's lived in Manitoba all her life and loves to travel, and birding is a key part of that travel wherever she goes. She completed her Master of Science from the U of M on cowbirds at Delta Marsh. She has been the resident naturalist at Hammock Marsh Interpretive Center for 22 years, and her job allows her to share her knowledge of birds with people of all ages. She coordinates the management of the leased land that the center sits on in the marsh in collaboration with Ducks Unlimited Canada and the province of Manitoba, and manages employee training and delivers natural history workshops to staff and the public. She also coordinates all of their wildlife surveys, including bird counts, as well as songbird banding, the songbird banding program that's offered at Hammock. Outside of Hammock, Paula was the coordinator for the Red River Valley region for the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, and she helped get the project up and running, coordinated volunteers for 5 years, and was part of the data review committee. Paula sits on the steering committee for the Manitoba Important Bird Areas program and has volunteered for both Christmas bird counts and breeding bird surveys for over 20 years. She started the Delta Marsh Bird Observatory in 1995 and has been involved with that organization since then. She currently sits on the board of directors for the banding station, and she has been banding songbirds for 28 years and has a master banding permit. So a big thank you to Paula for being our guest speaker on Prairie Wetland Birds of Manitoba today. So Paula, I will try to find you to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself.
I have unmuted myself because I could find me, so that was pretty good. So welcome everybody. This is my very first webinar delivering one, so I've spent lots of time in the last 8 weeks looking at other people's and enjoying learning information that way. So I'm hoping that I've learned a little from there about what to do and what not to do. This is a PowerPoint presentation that is going to talk about wetland birds that we find in prairie wetlands. So particularly Manitoba prairie wetlands. We're not going far north because as you get into the boreal forest and farther north, you get different kinds of birds, and I thought I would focus on ones we're more likely to see, in particular that you might see at Hammock Marsh, Whitewater Lake, the Shoal Lakes. Those are some of our big prairie wetlands that you can visit. Also, all of the little potholes across southern Manitoba, you will see most of these birds there as well. Sometimes you might have to wait a little bit, but they are there. I am not doing shorebirds because Christian Artuso covered that 2 weeks ago in his most excellent presentation, which was the first of these presentations, and he went into great detail about all of the shorebirds, and I believe that was recorded, so we can provide you with that link if you're interested in the shorebirds and missed that particular presentation. I'm going to focus on other things that you can see. So here we go. Maybe. Yes, here we go. All right. First technical difficulty overcome. So of course, Canada geese. Canada geese are found just about everywhere. And I'm not even going to describe what one looks like because I'm sure everybody knows, but they are one of the geese that you find in wetlands. There are other geese in Manitoba as well. Snow geese, Ross's geese, white-fronted geese, and cackling geese. All of those move through southern Manitoba on the way to their nesting grounds, or in the fall come by again through southern Manitoba on their way south. But the Canada goose is the only one that you will see during the summertime for the most part. There's the occasional leftover one. I saw a snow goose left over at Hammock Marsh just last week, but there's only one and he has moved on since then. So Canada goose. Swans, there are a variety of swans. There are 2 species of swans, tundra swan and trumpeter swan. This is tundra. It's all white, no black wingtips. The black bill, and you can see this one has quite a bit of yellow right by the eye, right at the bill. I think you can see me circling it with my, no, you can't see me circling it, I don't think, but it's right by the bill. And they are the most numerous swan. It's the one that you'll see if it's a flock of 10 or more, for sure it's going to be a tundra swan. If it's less than that, it might be the rarer one, the trumpeter swan. Most of these have moved through southern Manitoba, but you find them in the Interlake region. They start to breed there and farther north. And of course, what would a wetland be without a duck? Ducks can be broken into two large categories, the dabblers like this mallard and the divers. So we'll start with the dabblers. They're the ones that when they're feeding, their heads are down and their butts are up in the air, and they are feeding only as long as their neck can reach. Their feet are pretty far forward on their body, so they can jump out of the water like this one is doing and into flight. And that's how you sort of know it's a dabbler. We have two green-headed ducks. The mallard is the first green-headed duck. It has a green head, yellow bill, these bright orange legs that nobody really knows why it has bright orange legs. And then it's sort of chestnut around the throat and neck area down onto the chest. Probably the most common duck, probably the most common wetland bird that people will recognize after the Canada goose. Blueing teal is one of the smallest ducks that we have in wetlands. They are found throughout the prairie provinces. They have this leopard skin pattern on the side of their body, steel bluey gray head, and the white crescent right in front of the eye, between the eye and the bill. They nest in all kinds of small wetlands, so even all throughout the prairie pothole region, you'll find them in almost every little pothole, almost more often than you will find mallards in those kinds of small wetlands. They have a powder blue patch in their wing, which is where they get their name from. Northern shoveler is the second green-headed duck that we have. Can be confused with a mallard at a distance because you see a green head and you immediately think mallard. But if you look at the bill is a different color, but it is also shovel-shaped, which is great because that's where it gets its name from. And that's an easy way to tell the females as well. They have chestnut on the sides, white on the front, and they are found throughout, again, some of the larger wetlands. You don't find them a lot on the really tiny wetlands, but the larger ones certainly, we certainly have a fair number of them at Hammock Marsh. Northern pintail is another dabbler that we have. These move through early in the spring and then again in the fall, and they don't actually nest in most of southern Manitoba. They're into Saskatchewan and then Alberta. They like short crop, stubble fields, that kind of thing to nest in, and we don't have a lot of those around in southern Manitoba. We have some, but not a lot, but they won't nest in wetlands. They have a long, elongated neck, slender neck, brown head, and they have, of course, the long pin tails, which is where they get their name from. Green-winged teal is another tiny dabbler. It's closely related to not blue-winged teal, but shovelers, strangely enough. And so they are sort of separated in the order that I'm presenting them here. They are gray. They have a cinnamon-colored head with this big, gorgeous green crescent through the eye and around the head. And you can see this one has bright green in the wing, which is where it gets its name from. They are one of the last sort of ducks to arrive usually, and they're one of the last ones to leave. They will often be seen around standing on ice and things like that. So they're a beautiful little duck to see. Now we're moving on to the divers. Divers are feeding somewhere different. They can dive all the way to the bottom of a wetland, and they're feeding on something entirely different, often plants at the bottom. Their legs are farther back on their body, and so when they take off, they have to run like crazy, and it looks like a huge effort to get up off the water. They can't jump off like a dabbler can. Canvasback is one of the two red-headed ducks. It has a red head and a red eye, a black sloping bill, and a canvas colored back, whitish, more white than gray. And that's where it gets its name from. Redhead is the other kind of red-headed duck that we have. A more rounded head, a blue bill with a black tip, instead of a bright red eye like the canvasback, a yellow eye, and it has a gray body instead of the canvas white. And they're smaller and rounder. Both of these will nest in wetlands. They actually nest on the water. They build floating nests on the water or just on the edges of the wetland. And so in years of dry times, they are harder pressed to find suitable nesting habitat. But in wet years like this one and the last few that we've had, they are doing quite well because there's lots of habitat for them. One of the interesting things about redheads is in order to increase their productivity, the amount of young that they will actually lay their eggs in other red-headed duck nests, other female nests, and make their own clutch. They will even put those eggs in canvasback nests. It's called parasitism. And oh, pardon me. And so that's kind of a neat behavior that these guys have for increasing the number of young that they have. And then we get into these darn black and white ducks mostly, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they're pretty tricky to tell apart. So we're just going to talk about a couple of them. One is the lesser scaup. It's probably one of the more common ones. They like slightly deeper water, so all of the diving ducks like slightly deeper water because they need to dive to get there. Lesser scaup are white on the sides. They have a lesser amount of white in the wings compared to, say, the greater scaup. And their head, the sheen of their head is a purple sheen. On greater scaup, which is the easiest one to confuse them with, it's a green sheen to the head. So you can sort of see that here. It sort of looks purpley. And then maybe by far the cutest duck around is the ruddy duck. It belongs to a group of ducks called the stiff-tailed ducks, and you can see where it gets that from. A nice and stiff tail. They're ruddy colored. They have a black and white head, and they have this bright blue bill during breeding season. It fades a little bit, still blue, bluey gray in the fall and winter, but bright blue during the breeding season. And these guys have always been thought to be a little different than the rest of the ducks because you always see a female, the young, and a male all throughout the summer, which is different than all of the other ducks. All of the other ducks, the male hangs around for the first week while she's incubating, and then he goes off and we don't see him again for the rest of the season. Ruddy ducks were different, and people wondered why. What was the advantage? What were they doing? Why would they be so different? And so they did a whole bunch of research. And what they found was that he's not really looking after his young, because those are not his young that he is following around with the female. He will be next year's mate. So he is partly courting already while she still has this year's brood. He'll help her look after them with the hope that he will be next year's mate and next year's male for that brood. So kind of a different way and a different adaptation than many of the other ducks, or any of the other ducks for that matter. We're leaving the ducks now and we're moving into a group called Grebes. So ducks have webbed feet and that duck-shaped bill. All of the Grebes don't. They have a more pointed bill, not duck-shaped, not flat. And they also don't have webbed feet. They have little flaps of skin on their toes that help them paddle. Most of them also look like they don't have a tail. They're sort of cut off at the butt end. And that's a trait of all of the Grebes. Pied-billed Grebes have a nickname called marsh monkey. So they sound like a big monkey in the marsh, and that's kind of fun. And they also have a really neat behavior. When they get startled, unlike all the other ducks that will try and fly away or swim into the cattails, they have the ability to squeeze all of the air out of their feathers, and they sink like a submarine, and then they swim away quickly under the water. And that's kind of a really neat behavior to see. Eared grebe is another grebe that we find on small wetlands. Both eared grebes and the next one, horned grebes, are what we call semi-colonial, so they nest in loose groups. Eared grebes have a little bit of yellow on the side of the head here, black neck, black back, and a red body. And we'll just flip quickly to the horned grebe here, much more yellow, heavier yellow on the side of the head, a red neck, and then sort of a all brownish, blackish kind of body. It doesn't have two colors. Both of these are found in small wetlands. They both build nests, floating nests on the water out of cattails, and they are both, like I said, semi-colonial. Western grebes are much larger than the other grebes that we've seen, and like slightly larger wetlands. So you'll find them in Nanette, Delta, Netley, Lebo, those kinds. We have a few at Oak Hammock. And Whitewater is big enough to have a good number of Western grebes. They, again, just like all the grebes, are semi-colonial. They nest on floating nests on the water. And you can see here, Western grebe, the red eye is in the black. There's something called a Clark's grebe out there as well, which is much less common. And the black goes like this so that the white actually sits in the white part of the head. And the bill is a little bit orangey compared to this greeny yellow one. So those are two other grebes that we have. Pardon me. American white pelican, not so much a prairie wetland nester, but they do visit prairie wetlands to find food. So we always think they must eat big fish, and they do eat some big fish, but their favorite meal is small minnows. And prairie wetlands, small wetlands have lots of minnows. That's sort of the fish that we have in them. And so that's why you would find them in a prairie wetland. They're looking to feed. And they will fly 100 kilometers or more in a day to find a feeding site and take it back to their nest. I always think it's amazing how big they are, and that my favorite fact about pelicans is that in that pouch, they can hold 12 liters of water. That's like 6 big pop bottles or 3 giant jugs of milk. That's just an incredible amount of water that you can store in this little itty bitty pouch here when they're flying. Double-crested cormorant is another one that you'll find feeding in wetlands. They don't really nest. They like to nest with pelicans on islands in our big lakes, but they too are looking for fish, and they like the smaller fish as well. They're easier to handle, easier to eat. A pelican is black and white. A cormorant is all black. And you can see this orangey color on the face here. That is very distinctive of double-crested cormorants. Double-crested cormorants also don't have a lot of oil in their feathers. So if you've ever seen a bird sitting in a tree with its wings out looking like it's drying its wings, that's exactly what it's doing, because they need to dry those wings out entirely before they go diving for fish again or go swimming like this one. So it kind of takes a little bit of time for those to dry, and you would think that something that is made to fish would be waterproof, but not necessarily. American bittern is closely related to the herons. And you can see he's brown and white and streaky, and they have this great behavior. They will stand like this with their head straight up, and you can see the brown streaks on the throat, and that blends in perfectly with the cattails in the background, and they will actually sway back and forth slowly at the same speed the wind is moving the cattails, and they have perfect camouflage. If these guys drop into a stand of cattails, you cannot find them at all. It is just perfect camouflage. Sometimes they do this in parking lots, and then it doesn't work so well, but most of the time it is a great behavior when startled. Great blue heron is another large bird that is associated with wetlands. They like to nest in trees and build their nest in trees. So if the wetland doesn't have trees, they may not be there for the nesting season, but they will certainly be moving through during spring and fall migration. They are very tall birds, about 4 to 4.5 feet tall, so they're hard to miss. They're bluey gray all over. They're just a cool sight to see. I know that they nest up in the Shoal Lakes area, so that is one place you can see them during the summer months. Great egret is another fairly unusual. 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, they were a rare sight in southern Manitoba. People would flock to wherever they were spotted, and you could see lots of cars lined up looking for great egrets. They now nest in a variety of different places. Shoal Lakes is one, Dog Lake, Whitewater Lake is another place they nest. I actually was at Hammock Marsh on Sunday morning and saw one fly across the road. So they are around. They are about the size of a great blue heron, just a little bit shorter. As you can see here, all white, black legs, and a yellow bill. Black-crowned night heron is another very prairie, probably the most prairie heron that we have. They are have a black crown, and they are gray all over the body. And the night heron part refers to when they like to hunt most. They're a dusk and dawn kind of hunter, and they nest at Whitewater Lake, they nest at Hammock Marsh. I would assume they nest at Shoal Lakes as well. And they again are semi-colonial. So there's always safety in numbers, it seems, in prairie wetlands. And so you'll get loose colonies of a dozen or even up to 24 black-crowned night herons nesting in a small area, again trying to ward off and warn each other of predators in the area. Here's another rare one, is the white-faced ibis. And if we thought great egrets were rare and got people excited, well, my goodness, white-faced ibises really get people excited, really get birders excited. And even still, you call one out and people will go and see it. About 10 or 12 years ago, they started to nest at Whitewater Lake. They are likely nesting in the Shoal Lakes region again, but they are kind of a really cool bird. They are an ibis, so they have this down curved bill. You can see in the breeding plumage, it has this white around the face. That's where it gets its name from. Not a lot of white. I think they could have done better than that. And they are this beautiful purple and green and copper, and they're just so iridescent. They are just a gorgeous bird. They're kind of gangly looking. They're certainly noticeable. If they're in an area, people are going to spot them and notice them because they are so very different. Moving away a little bit from some of the water birds into some of the birds that you might see around a wetland or that use wetlands for hunting purposes and for food and for other things other than living in it. And bald eagle is probably a good example. We have a pair nesting at Hammock Marsh, and we have them year round. They stay all winter long, and they, you know, the white head and white tail of a bald eagle is pretty distinctive. It takes about 5 years to get that white head and white tail. So until then, they look pretty motley, but they're good at cleaning up things. So in the fall, in all of the wetlands and across the southern prairies, you will see lots of bald eagles around, and they're cleaning up whatever didn't make it. And they'll stay until, in good numbers, until usually the mid to end of November, depending on how freeze up goes. And they're just, like I said, cleaning up anything that didn't make it. And that is the majestic bald eagle. Northern harrier is another wetland associated raptor. It used to be called a marsh hawk. It has changed its name some time ago now. This one is a female. It is all brown, but you can still see the little white rump, or white where the tail joins the body. The males are gray, but still have that white rump. They have a very owl-shaped face. They hunt and can hear very well. They fly low over the marsh. They have what's called dihedral, so a V shape in their wings when they're hunting. They nest on the ground in upland habitats around wetlands. You don't see them very much too far from wetlands, but they need to hunt enough, so those are the fields and upland habitats around wetlands. Sora is a very secretive bird. They belong to the rail family, and they have these big long toes that allow them to walk on the cattails or even on some of the aquatic plants that are in the wetland itself. We often hear them calling before we ever see them, or if we ever see them, but if you do, between the bright yellow bill and the little black face mask, it is distinctive. You can't mistake it for anything else. American coot is another bird in the rail family, and like the Sora that we just saw, they don't have webbed feet. These guys have little flaps of skin on their toes, but that means that they don't paddle very well like a duck would. And so when they're moving through the water, it looks like a big chicken moving back and forth through the water. They're moving their head back and forth, and it's kind of a jerky motion through the wetland. They're all black, dark gray in some areas. They have big white tails that they can put up. You can sort of see it right here at the end. They can put that up when they're agitated. They have this red eye and the little red nubbin on the top of the head, and then a pretty white bill. They like to build floating nests in the wetland as well, and they have some pretty fancy looking babies. They're black and red, and some people think they're ugly. Some people there think only a face a mother could love. They're cute in their own way. I just put in an American avocet here just to remind you that yes, we do see lots of shorebirds in wetlands. For the most part, they migrate through spring and fall. There were 15 species of shorebirds at Okamic on Saturday when I was there, so now is the time. It's just about finished. There are a few, like the American avocet, that will actually nest in a wetland, and we will see them throughout the summer. But Christian covered most of that a couple of weeks ago. Some other kinds of birds that we see are Franklin's gulls. So there are two black-headed gulls in Manitoba, the Franklins and the Bonapartes. Franklin's is a prairie wetland species. They nest in those wetlands in huge colonies. Bonapartes are found on the large lakes. So if you're in southern Manitoba, the little wetland, it's most likely a Franklin's gull that you're seeing with that black head. At Okamic Marsh, because they nest in colonies, one year we had 10,000 of them nesting in the marsh. Some years we have none. So there's something very specific they like about the openness, the water depth, the amount of vegetation, and if it isn't perfect, they're moving on to a different wetland. Black tern is our next candidate here for wetland birds. It belongs to the tern family, which are loosely related to the gulls, and it's all black. It sort of looks a little bit gray on the wings, but it's still a black. They are found in good numbers in all prairie wetlands of all sizes. Even little wetlands will have a black tern or two. On the larger ones, they nest in small colonies as well, and they become very aggressive as soon as their young leave the nest. So if you're walking one of the dikes at Whitewater Lake or at Okamic Marsh, and these birds are starting to gather around you, you can kind of look and you usually see the young off to the sides of the dike, and these guys will actually hit you in the head if you get too close to their young. So they're lots of fun to watch. They don't eat fish like the next tern we're going to see. These guys are picking insects up off the top of the water, so they don't dive into the water like Forster's terns do. Forster's tern is the other prairie tern that you will see. It is the white tern in prairie wetlands. It is light towards the wingtips here. A common tern is dark at this point. These are lighter colored. These are eating fish, so they're diving in for those small minnows. They don't eat large fish. And they too will nest in wetlands. Short-eared owls, we have at wetlands. They of course like the upland habitat. This picture is in the winter. They will occasionally spend the winter here in Manitoba, in southern Manitoba. A couple of years ago, we had them coming to our bird feeders in the middle of winter at Okamic Marsh. They were not eating seeds. They were looking for other things that come to bird feeders, but they do nest in the upland habitats around wetlands. And they kind of look like a big moth when they're flying, sort of, I like to call it a floopy kind of wing beat, so they're pretty distinctive. But they do like the upland habitat and not right in the water part of it. Moving now to songbirds. Again, there are all kinds of songbirds. Very few of them are found in the wetland, but in the surrounding. Eastern kingbird is one of the flycatchers that you can find in and around lots of prairie wetlands. White on the belly, has white around the tail or the white tail band, and a big flat bill, and you can even see a little whisker right there. They have what are called rictal bristles, and they're like cat whiskers, if you will, and it protects their eyes from insect bits when they bite down on an insect. So that is one of the kind of cool things about eastern kingbirds. If you ever see an eastern kingbird and it has a dragonfly in its mouth, I suggest that you sit and watch it eat that dragonfly because it is really one of the most amazing things to see. It'll pluck off the wings and then it starts to eat them. It's kind of an interesting thing to look at. Common ravens are common, and they are common just about everywhere in Manitoba. They are big and black. I don't think I need to say much more than that about them, but they are scavengers, and so they will come along and collect anything that didn't make it as well. They start nesting early, so February, and they are actually done nesting by now. And now you'll see family groups around as they move around and teach their young what to eat and how to find it. Tree swallow is one of the common swallows that we have around wetlands, and it's common particularly if there are tree swallow boxes up. And I think in southern Manitoba, we've done a pretty good job of spreading tree swallow boxes around everywhere. And they are white on the belly. They nest in holes. They're this beautiful bluey, greeny, shiny color on the back, and they're just kind of a neat little bird to see. Bank swallow is another one that you will see in and around wetlands. They need banks because they actually will burrow holes into the side of the bank and then make their nest at the end of that tunnel. And so if the wetland has some islands that have eroded or have gravel somewhere nearby, you will often get bank swallows. They're smaller than tree swallows. This is as colorful as they get. They sort of are brown all over, and you can see they have just a slight brown chest band across the chest. And probably the most familiar swallow that we have is the barn swallow. It's this bluey purple on the back again, rusty color on the face and chest, and then it pales as it goes down towards the end of the tail. They are the ones that build those little mud cup nests, and one of the two things about these guys that are kind of cool. It takes about 1,000 trips with a little mouthful of mud back and forth to make that nest that we all know and love so much on the side of buildings. I think that's just phenomenal. The other thing is that they are now on the threatened or endangered species list, species at risk list, and they are considered threatened in many parts of Canada. There are two wrens that you commonly find in wetlands. One is the sedge wren, and the other is the marsh, which we'll see in just a second. Sedge wrens, both wrens actually, you will often hear them long before you ever see them. Sedge wrens sound like a tick tick and then a trill afterwards, and that tick tick, I always think sedge likes drier habitat, and so you know when you have a dry mouth it sort of goes. That sound is sort of how their song starts. Whereas marsh wren, they're in the marsh itself. They have a much more watery, bubbly call than sedge wrens. They all like to sit up occasionally to sing, so you might be lucky enough to see them at the top of the cattails. One of the best things about marsh wrens, I think, is about how they attract a mate. And yes, they can sing beautifully and relentlessly and all day long, but they build what are called dummy nests. A regular marsh wren nest is sort of a round ball of cattails with a hole inside. And the male will go along and he will build up to a dozen in his territory. And then the female will come along and she'll look at all of them and she'll say, yeah, okay, you'll do. And she may then finish one on the inside, or she may build her own 13th nest that she likes. And the idea is that if I'm so busy and can build all of these nests and sing and defend a territory and eat, then I must be a very fit male and I am a good choice, so pick me. Is sort of the idea behind all of that. But it's really neat to see the nests. You normally see them in the fall when the cattails turn brown, and you can see them throughout the winter. One of the common warblers in a wetland is the common yellowthroat, and you can see where it gets its name from. Bright yellow throat, black face patch and then this white band on top of it. They're pretty secretive. I've spent many, many years looking for nests of different species, and I have never found a common yellow-throat nest. It's sort of one of my goals before I'm no longer able to walk through a wetland to find a nest. These are the ones that say witchity, 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 witch, is what they sound like, but they are pretty common in wetlands. The other common warbler that we have in wetlands is the yellow warbler. They like willows, so you need a little bit drier. Usually you find willows on the edges of a wetland. They're truly the only all yellow warbler that we have. So yellow on the head, yellow on the back, yellow on the belly, yellow on the tail. And then the males have these nice chestnut colored streaks on the front. So that's how you can tell that it is a male. They sing sweet, sweet, I'm so sweet, and they are very sweet, sweet looking, and they're always a treat to see in a wetland. We're going to talk about a few of the sparrows that call wetlands home. Clay-colored sparrow is one of them. I think it should have been called the clay-collared sparrow, so they have a very gray collar around here, and it goes all the way around. No streaking on the breast. And they're the ones that sound like an insect. They go bzz, bzz, bzz. And often people will say, well, that's a grasshopper. Nope, nope, it's not a grasshopper. It is a clay-colored sparrow. They like little shrubs, so you have to have, they'll nest at the bottom of a shrub, so you have to have shrubs around, so roses or snowberry, something around a wetland, and that's where they will be nesting. Song sparrow is another very common sparrow. They have streaks on the breast, and they'll actually make a black dot right about here on many of them. It's a little hard to see on this picture. They have long tails, and they sing a lot, which is where they get their name from. They are found throughout wetlands across Manitoba. Swamp sparrows like it a little bit wetter than, say, song sparrows do, so they'll be found in the cattails and in the phragmites that you see on the edges of wetlands. A little bit of streaking here on the side, but mostly unstreaked breast, a reddish cap, and a big bunch of gray on the head here, almost this V shape you can see, and then reddish on the shoulders. They sound very much like a chipping sparrow. They sort of trill throughout. It's just a trill that you hear in the marsh. And who doesn't know red-winged blackbird? They are common in ditches, small wetlands, large wetlands, deep wetlands, shallow wetlands. Every wetland you can possibly think of, you will find red-winged blackbirds. They are all black with red on the shoulder here and a band of tan colored. Some is a brighter yellow. This one is buffy colored. One thing you need to know about red-winged blackbirds is they can cover all of this up with these black feathers. And so you can see a red-winged blackbird and not actually see the red wing part of it. And when they're angry or displaying, they can move all those black feathers and you see big, bright red patches. It usually means that they are angry at something, and red-winged blackbirds spend a lot of time angry. Yellow-headed blackbird is another blackbird that is found in wetlands, and it is a western species, so you don't have to go very much farther east than Winnipeg, and you don't see them anymore. They just don't occur in eastern Canada. They have a yellow head, which is where they get their name from. And they like exactly the same habitat as red-winged blackbirds. They like slightly deeper water. In the cattails is where they nest. They're picking insects out of the cattails, and that's what they're feeding on. That's what they're feeding their young. Yellow-headed blackbirds are a little bit larger and a little bit more aggressive than red-winged blackbirds, so they will drive the red-winged blackbirds to less optimal habitat and take over the really good habitat. And red-winged blackbirds are pretty okay with that because they do well in all kinds of habitats. So they don't need deep water. They're good with ditch water or the shallow wetland edges, whereas a yellow-headed blackbird is not. Common grackle is another blackbird that you see just about everywhere. We also have them in the city of Winnipeg, and I'm sure every city and town has a population of grackles. They nest just about anywhere. They're found just about anywhere. That big sharp bill, their favorite food is acorns, so they're obviously going to occur in drier places because oaks don't grow in the wetlands, but that bill is enough to crack open acorns, so you get an idea of how sharp it is. They have the bright yellow eye, the purple, dark blue, shiny head, and then a bronzy black a body. Can even have some greenish tones to it as well. Might be one of my favorite birds, probably one of the most hated birds across North America is the brown-headed cowbird. It is a blackbird as well. It has a brown head and a black body. And I think it is so cool that it is what we call an obligate brood parasite. The female must lay its eggs in other birds' nests, and those birds then raise them. They don't have the ability to actually make their own nest. And this has caused all kinds of responses from what are called the hosts, those that are going to help hatch those eggs, and brown-headed cowbirds. And it is just, to me, a fascinating topic and an amazing adaptation or series of adaptations that cowbirds have and hosts have. I can talk about it for hours. I do other presentations just on cowbirds because it is just so remarkable to me. American goldfinch is probably known to most people as well because it is comes to feeders so readily. Some people call it wild canary. It is bright yellow with this little black patch in the forehead and black wings, black and white wings. In the fall and winter, it becomes much more subdued colored. They come to feeders quite readily. They are always so joyful and bubbly. They eat thistle seeds for the most part. They'll eat some insects, but thistle seeds is really their favorite. And so they don't start nesting until a little bit later when the thistles have gone to seed. And finally, a house sparrow. House sparrow is not really a sparrow. Let's start with that. It is actually a weaver finch. It is an introduced species from Europe. And they are really good at living just about everywhere. And so if you have ever put up a feeder, you have probably had a house sparrow come to it. And they are found just about everywhere, so including the edges of wetlands and things like that. And I think that might be my last one. Yes, so thank you so much for listening to me. I hope we learned a little bit today together. And I'd like to thank the IBA program for asking me to present this. And I'd like to thank Hammock Marsh Interpretive Center for saying yes. And I see that we have one question, so I will answer that. If you have other questions, you can certainly post them right away, and we will do our very best to answer them. I think we have about 10 minutes left or so. So the question is, what's the best way to tell between a raven and a crow? That is a great question because they're both all black. Crows traditionally are more urban oriented, whereas ravens are more rural. So location can help you a little bit, but there is crossover. Ravens are much larger than crows, so that can help as well. Crows have fan-shaped tails. So it goes out and sort of a nice fan at the bottom, whereas a raven has what we call a wedge-shaped tail, so it goes out and then it comes back into a point. The other thing that I like to use is sort of bill. So to me, a crow looks like its bill belongs on its head. It looks proportionate. A raven's bill to me looks disproportionate, like it's too heavy and it kind of wants to drag the head down. So it's just a huge bill for the size of the bird. And the last thing I like to look at is, particularly if they're flying, because they're flying by and they're not showing you any of the features that I've just talked about, is that crows actually row with their wings. So they move them forward and it looks like rowing a boat, so oars, whereas a raven just flaps up and down. So a crow rows, and that is a very distinctive behavior. I read it in a book once and said, that's just crazy. I don't believe that. So the next time I saw both crows and ravens, I stopped and I looked and I had a really good look with my binoculars. And you know what? The book was right. They actually row. So it's a really distinctive behavior. And Amanda, I don't see any other questions. Do you?
I have one. Yeah, I have one more question here. And it is from Bob, and he asks, how do ravens keep their young warm in February and March?
Well, that is a really good question. Feathers are great insulators, and so just like we wear down jackets, ravens will grow more feathers throughout the winter, so will chickadees, so that they just have more feathers, and then they kind of puff up and put air in between those feathers, just like we would in a down jacket, and they stay pretty close and sit on the nest pretty much all of the time. I would also assume that the young are a little bit hardier than, say, yellow warblers are, or other summertime species, but mostly it's just they're really good at insulating, and they've got those extra feathers that a yellow warbler wouldn't grow, but winter birds do grow those extra feathers.
There's not too many of us, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, the program can probably handle that if you're unsure about typing in the chat box. So just wait a second, see if anybody does.
Hello, Catherine speaking.
Hello, Catherine.
Hi, I just was wondering about the Whitewater Lake, and would it still be a good time to see shorebirds and wetland birds there?
So, Amanda, do you want to answer this, or do you want me to?
It is up to you, Paula. I was actually there on Saturday, and we saw total for wetland birds 93 species. So there's certainly wetland birds there. Shorebirds, depending on what species you're looking at, I think some of them had already passed through, but there still were some species there.
And that's what I would say about whitewater generally, is it is a great time to go to Whitewater Lake anywhere from, I would say, early May to early October, but you'll see different things. So it depends on what kinds of birds you're interested in. If you're interested in shorebirds, probably we've moved through the peak, but there'll be another peak in August of them coming when they come back north. If you're looking for waterfowl and grebes and those kinds of things, then now June is a great time to see those birds. If you want to see the egrets and the white-faced ibises and those kinds of birds, then you're probably going to want to go first week of August, that kind of time. So it all depends on what you most want to see. If you want to see lots of sandhill cranes and lots of snow geese, then you're talking about early October.
Thank you very much, both of you.
My pleasure.
We also have a question from Jane. She's asking about the ruddy duck. Do they keep the same mate from year to year?
No, they don't. So they get a new mate every year, and it's the male that sort of helped her look after the young the year before. So no, every year they are looking for new. They're not like Canada geese, for instance, will mate for multiple years with the same pair, but ducks are not like that.
Just another note here on the chat about whitewater. Renee said that herself and Tom were at Whitewater on Friday and had 77 species, including ruddy turnstones. And other than that, does anybody else want to ask a question either verbally and unmute themselves or through chat?
Can I ask where the ibis and egrets go? Because they weren't at Whitewater a week ago. How far north do they go?
So they don't go farther north than that. They will be nesting in the cattails, and when they're nesting, they become incredibly difficult to find. They are hunkered down and hiding essentially. And once the young are out of the nest and they're starting to move around, that's when we see them more, which is why it's sort of usually the beginning of August when we see good numbers, and then they will fly south for the winter. But Whitewater Lake, and there are some at Shoal Lake, but those are about as far north as they go.
Thank you.
From Danielle in the chat, we have, outside of migration season, can I expect to see any wetland species up in Churchill?
outside of the breeding season? No.
Outside of migration season.
So yeah, so sure, yes, there's lots that breed. So I was thinking winter, sorry, and certainly not in the winter. It gets too frozen. But during the breeding season, there are loons that nest there. There are a variety of shorebirds that sort of nest, not in the town of Churchill, but around Churchill. There are long-tailed ducks that nest there. I'm trying to think of other species. I've only been there once, so I'm trying to think of all the things that we saw. There will be other upland species around, but those are sort of the wetland species.
I have another one from Jillian. Is anything going on at Delta this year? Jillian, do you want to clarify that either through the chat or through your microphone?
Sure, yeah. Anything in terms of people activity? I'm guessing the birds are there, but anything in terms of banding or opportunities to go and help with banding?
So we don't band at Delta Marsh anymore. So we used to band there until the flood of 2011, and it washed away our banding hut, most of the habitat, our accommodations, sort of everything got washed away. And we looked for a new home in and around Delta for 3 or 4 years, and it was just too difficult to find all of the logistic things that we needed. So I work at Hammock Marsh, and we had a small banding program at Hammock Marsh at the same time. And I said, well, let's just try. So in 2015, we tried a full season at Hammock Marsh, and holy moly, it worked really quite well. And it was much easier from a visitor perspective, from a volunteer perspective, just a larger population base close to us in Winnipeg. And so we have moved to Hammock Marsh permanently. And so we are banding right now, starting June 1st, we're going to open to the public. For the month of May, we were closed because of COVID to the public, but we've now sort of relaxing some of those restrictions. So if you're interested, we band Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays, and likely Sundays at Hammock Marsh. And our bander in charge is Meredith, and she would be more than happy for you to come by, and she'll show you what we do.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm in Brandon, so Delta was actually closer
I
to me.
know. I know it was, but you might be the only person it was closer to. So
well, there are 1 or 2 other here, I know.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, but yes, no, my daughter's in Winnipeg, so I can maybe go and see her too. So, all right, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, then we will wrap this webinar up. So thank you everyone for spending time with us. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be available on the Manitoba IBA YouTube channel. It has to download and buffer first, so I'll probably be getting it up there tomorrow or the day after. And also a big thank you to Hammock Marsh Interpretive Center and to Paula for spending time with us today and talking about birds.
It was my pleasure. I had a great time. Thank you so much for inviting me.